Two doctors looked at Beck Weathers near the summit of Mount Everest. 12 hours apart, both reached the same conclusion. This man is dead. Leave him. This is the true survival story of the 1996 Everest disaster, told through the body what severe hypothermia does to a human being at 26,000 feet, in the zone climbers call the death zone.
This is the anatomy of survival.
Beck Weathers had been lying in the snow for most of a night and most of a day. His core temperature had collapsed, his face was a mask of ice, and frostbite was already eating his hands. By every signal a doctor is trained to read, his body had stopped. Over the next few minutes, I'll walk you through exactly what was happening inside him, stage by stage, and why two experienced doctors were both certain he was dead and both wrong. And both of those doctors were experienced. They had triaged dying climbers before. On a mountain where carrying a living person down is barely possible, carrying a dead one is a death sentence for the rescuers. So they made the call that the mountain forces you to make. They marked him as beyond saving, and they moved on to people they could still help. Here's the problem. Beck Weathers was not dead. A few hours after the second doctor walked away, his eyes opened. He stood up, and he walked, blind, frostbitten, alone, back toward camp. So what did two competent doctors see? Told them to give up? And what was happening inside his body that they could not see at all? That is what this is about. Not a miracle, but a physiology that looks exactly like death until the moment it doesn't. Beck Weathers was a pathologist from Dallas, 50 years old, methodical, the kind of man who reads his own lab results. He had spent years and a great deal of money to stand on top of the world, and on the morning of May 10th, 1996, he was close. Then his eyes failed him. Years earlier, Weathers had undergone radial keratotomy, surgery to correct his vision. What no one had told him was how that reshaped cornea behaves at extreme altitude. As the air pressure dropped, his corneas distorted, and his sight dissolved into a useless blur. Somewhere above 27,000 feet, the pathologist who reads fine print could no longer see his own hands. His guide, Rob Hall, gave him an order that made sense at the time. Wait here, don't move. I'll collect you on the way down. So Weathers sat on a high, exposed shoulder of the mountain called the balcony, and he waited. He waited as the afternoon burned away. He waited as other climbers passed him going down. He waited because a disciplined man honors the plan, and because blind, he had no safe way to descend alone. Hall never came back. Higher up, the weather was killing him too. Above 26,000 feet is what climbers call the death zone, a place with roughly a third of the oxygen at sea level, where the body cannot recover, only degrade. Weathers was already blind, already cold, already starved of oxygen. And then the sky turned white. To understand what those doctors saw, you have to understand what cold does to a body. In order, first, the body fights. As core temperature slips below 35 degrees Celsius, it shivers, violent involuntary muscle contraction that burns fuel to make heat. At the same time, it slams shut the blood vessels in the skin and limbs, pulling warm blood inward to protect the only things that cannot wait. The heart and the brain. This is triage, and the body runs it automatically. The hands, the feet, the face are spent first, because they are survivable losses. This is the decision that would later cost Weathers his right hand and most of his left. Then the body starts to lose. Below about 32 degrees, the shivering fades. The furnace goes quiet, not because the danger passed, but because the fuel and the coordination to shiver are gone. Now the cooling accelerates. Speech slurs, movement stops, judgment dissolves. Some victims, in a final misfire of the temperature-regulating brain, feel a surge of warmth and tear their clothes off. Weathers was found with his jacket open to the waist. Below about 28 degrees, the body looks like it has stopped. The heart slows to a crawl and beats erratically. Breathing becomes shallow and rare. The pupils can fix and dilate. To an examiner in a storm, with frozen hands and failing oxygen of his own, there may be no detectable pulse, no detectable breath. The person appears by every fast bedside test to be dead. But here is the twist. The cold hides. That same deep cooling that mimics death also slows the brain's need for oxygen to almost nothing. The colder the brain gets, the less it requires to survive. The very thing shutting Weathers down was, at the same moment, keeping his brain alive on almost no oxygen. He was not dying of the cold. He was being preserved by it. The morning after the storm, May 11th, a doctor from the team climbed out to check on the two climbers still missing on the high slopes. He reached them in brutal cold. He cleared the ice from their faces. He checked them the way the mountain allows, fast, with frozen hands, in thin air that starves the examiner as much as the patient. Both were barely breathing. Both were unresponsive. Their exposed skin was frozen. By the standard that altitude imposes, could this person survive being moved? And is moving them worth risking the team? The answer was no. He made the hardest call in mountaineering. He left them where they lay, and he went back to spend the team's strength on the living. This was a defensible medical decision. It was also wrong about Beck Weathers, because that afternoon, Weathers woke up. Some part of his cooled, oxygen-starved brain switched back on, and a man who had been written off stood up in the snow. He could not see. He had no idea where he was. But he aimed himself downhill, and he walked into Camp 4 on his own feet, a corpse by the morning's reckoning, arriving under its own power. And then it happened a second time. He was so far gone, frostbitten, hypothermic, incoherent, that the exhausted climbers who took him in did not expect him to last the night. He was placed in a tent, and in the chaos and the cold he was, in effect, left again to die before morning. During the night, the wind tore his tent partly open and knocked his oxygen away. He should not have survived that either. The next morning, they found him alive a second time. Two competent judgments of death. 2 times the body underneath them refused to agree. Beck Weathers survived, but survival at that depth of cold is never free. And the bill comes from the decision his body made in the first hours. Remember the triage. To keep the core alive, the body had clamped off blood to the hands, the feet, the face, and held it there for nearly a day. Starved of warm blood, that tissue froze. And frozen tissue is not just cold tissue. Ice crystals form inside and between the cells, tearing them apart from within, while the cut-off blood supply finishes what the cold started. By the time he was warm again, the damage was done and irreversible. The body had spent his extremities to buy his life, exactly as designed. The cost was written on his hands. Weathers lost his right arm below the elbow. He lost all the fingers and the thumb of his left hand. He lost his nose, which surgeons later rebuilt. The black, mummified tissue that surgeons removed was the receipt for a transaction his body had run automatically on a ridge at 26,000 feet. Getting him off the mountain took its own miracle of nerve. Too weak to climb down, Weathers was brought to a point where a helicopter could attempt a landing at extraordinary altitude. Thin air that barely holds a rotor. One of the highest altitude helicopter rescues ever flown. A single pilot, a single shot, a margin of almost nothing. It worked. The pathologist who had gone blind, frozen, and been declared dead twice came home alive. Changed, reduced, rebuilt, but alive. The body had not failed him. It had run an ancient program ruthlessly well. Sacrifice the edges, protect the center, and wait for a chance that, against every reasonable expectation, actually came. So what do we take from a man who was declared dead twice and walked home anyway? Not that the doctors were fools. They weren't. They read the body in front of them correctly by every fast signal available. No pulse they could find, no breath, frozen skin, fixed eyes. The lesson is stranger than human error. It's that deep cold erases the very signs we use to define death, while quietly protecting the one organ that matters most. At that temperature, dead and barely alive look identical from the outside. The line between them is drawn inside the body, in the chemistry of a brain cooled almost to a stop. That is why doctors have a saying about the deeply cold. Nobody is dead until they are warm and dead. Beck Weathers is the reason that sentence exists. His body ran the oldest survival program there is. Sacrifice the edges, defend the core, lower the brain's demands, and buy time. And it ran it well enough to outlast 2 reasonable verdicts of death. He paid for it with his hands and his face. But he came back from a place the human body is not supposed to come back from. because the same cold that looked like it was killing him was underneath, keeping him alive. If this is the kind of story you want to understand from the inside, The Human Body at the Edge, explained. Subscribe to Anatomy of Survival. Real cases, real science, no fiction.
It was the anatomy of survival.